Welcome, everyone. Excited to have you all joining us on this beautiful snowy day for our Lunch and Learn that's going to be focused on BDSM and ethics, what social workers should know. It is, of course, something that will count towards your mandatory ethics requirement or just in general formal professional development. And very grateful to Madeline Rae, who is doing her master's research on this topic and who is gracious enough to come and share some of her knowledge and wisdom in this area with us. We're going to begin with a land acknowledgement. I invite you to join with me in the chat. Please put in the bottom, you can see in the bottom right, we see placenames.mapdev.ca, or you can just Google. But please join with me in the chat and acknowledge the correct Indigenous name of where you are located from. So for example, if you are in Halifax, you would write down that you are in Kijipuktuk as a way of helping us reconnect with the original names of where we are located. And I invite you before I read or while I'm reading this land acknowledgement to take a moment, perhaps look outside if you have a window, to feel connected to the land, maybe taking a moment to take in the beautiful snow that is falling down and reflecting on the ways in which this snow can help with our planet and its current warming crisis. Maybe take a moment to feel connected to the land. If there's a spot in that you feel especially connected to the land, maybe it's a hiking trail, maybe it's a beach, maybe it's your garden or a park, but just take a moment to close your eyes and connect with the land. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Unama'ki, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. And as we pause in gratitude, let us also have this moment of gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. When we acknowledge the land, we must also begin to acknowledge the wisdom of this planet and align ourselves with its truths. We are all treaty people. So how does this impact what we do and how we do it? And how will it guide our work together today? The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to both learning and to unlearning. Decolonizing means healing intergenerational trauma to understand the ways that it has been passed down to us and internalized. Restorative processes can help us to heal because they integrate trauma-informed processes that recognize our shared wounds and focuses on joining with others to break down intersectional silos and unite to fix the colonial systems and intergenerational trauma we inherited rather than pointing fingers. This is also the basis of just culture and safety practices. Safer social work practice means reflecting upon the ways that our positionality impacts what we do and how we experience the world around us. So we take this moment to reflect upon where we are in our own decolonizing journey and how are we integrating self-awareness and restorative justice into our work and into our professional development. Intersectionality is one way that we can begin to see where our power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. And it is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege, be it regarding race, ethnicity, gender identity, class, language, or many other different forms of intersectional oppression. It was first coined by African-American feminist theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. And decolonizing ourselves in our practice means recognizing the ways in which we are each impacted by the colonial system in which we all participate, and from which those of us of settler descent continue to benefit. Each of us, depending upon our social location and intersectional positionality, are uniquely impacted or oppressed. For example, those of us from African descent were dispossessed and uprooted from their land and brought to Turtle Island against their will as part of the white supremacy and slave trade that fueled the settlement of this continent. Let us take this moment to reflect upon the unique impact of colonization upon each of us and our practice. Decolonizing ourselves and our practice is a journey. Where are we in our quest for safer social work practice? As we look upon the ways in which we have to work together to dismantle racism in all of our systems, in our own thinking, and in our practice, in order to ensure safer social work for all. This reflects the new CASW Code of Ethics, which is committing us to shift from the illusion of neutrality to actively becoming anti-racist and fighting against racism and all intersectional prejudice that is part of colonization. It is in this spirit that we are excited to have this Lunch and Learn to think about the ways in which stigma and bias and prejudice and the lack of learning has contributed to our own not yet fully understanding issues around sexuality and how that can cause potential harm and risk when we are working with people. So very grateful to Madeline Rae, who is going to be talking about BDSM and social work ethics. Madeline is a sex educator and writer living in Kijipuktuk, Mi'kmaq, and holds a BFA honors and a BA in psychology from Treaty 1, and is completing her clinical MSW at Dalhousie University and plans to work as a sex therapist. So we are so very grateful to Madeline for bringing some of her knowledge and her experience and her passion and her research to us. Madeline is trained in client-centered sex education, pro-choice reproductive and sexual health counseling, WPATH gender-affirming care, and harm reduction. And her work and research investigates the therapeutic potentials of BDSM, the ritual space of performance, pleasure activism, and the sensual reclamation of bodily autonomy. With all of that, I can now stop share and invite Madeline to speak and share her screen, and so excited to learn from you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here on this snowy day. I'll share my screen. Oh, you know what? I want to make sure my audio is sharing here. Yes, I'm sharing sound. Okay. Naj has the audio. Can everyone hear me okay?
You are great. Your screen is great. Everything is great.
All right. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and land acknowledgement. I was practicing my breathing throughout that. I'm really excited and, of course, a little bit nervous because this topic is so dear to my heart. Thank you all for joining for the presentation on the ethics of BDSM, which still remains quite a taboo and somewhat contentious topic. So I'm really honored and thankful to the College of Social Workers, Naj, and also Jay Benoit, who I see is here. Thank you so much for supporting me in this journey and giving me this opportunity. On Valentine's Day, no less, kind of topical. So I know Naj did a wonderful land acknowledgement. I'm currently sitting in Kijipuktuk Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people, also the home of African Nova Scotians for over 400 years. So to give some, to contextualize my land acknowledgement with this presentation, I have a few question prompts for you folks to think about during the presentation and hopefully continuing after. So the first one is, how has sexuality been used as a tool of colonization? How has sexuality been used to attack Indigenous and Black bodies and communities, as well as other people of color and communities of color? And what work needs to be done on this land within this community and beyond to support sexual sovereignty? For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term sexual sovereignty, I do have some resources at the end of my presentation that I'm happy to send out. More or less, it refers to a form of Indigenous resurgence through reclaiming sexual and bodily autonomy and celebrating Indigenous sexuality. So I just want to give a brief content warning. We will be talking about some hard things today, some harmful power dynamics, sexual exploitation and coercion, rape culture, sexual assault, torture, and murder. So some tough topics. So take care of yourself how you need to. This is being recorded, so if you need to take a break and return later, or just take a break and not return, totally understandable. Take care of yourself. I'm going to give a little introduction to how I came to be here talking and doing research on BDSM. We'll do a brief brainstorm together and then look at some definitions of BDSM from an academic perspective as well as from a community perspective. We're going to spend a decent chunk of time looking at history and cultural formation of the BDSM community. So looking at early psychoanalysis and how that's led to the pathologization of BDSM. We'll talk a bit about media representations and a little bit about law and the ways that folks in the BDSM community have been discriminated against through law, as well as the harms of law and legal policy not being aware of proper codes of conduct within the community. We'll talk about something called the sex war. Some of you may know what that refers to and others not, as well as some general ethical concerns about BDSM and how to respond to those. We'll talk about what it means to play with power and how to do this safely. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about a lot of the representation of many marginalized communities within the BDSM community and explore why this might be the case. And then we'll talk about takeaways and what, as social workers, we need to know to really show up for our clients and our community. And then hopefully we'll have time for discussion, but Naj told me not to worry about that. So I tried to time myself, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so you all have sort of heard my bio. My name's Madeline. My pronouns are she, her. I am a cisgender white settler queer woman from Treaty 1, Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I moved to Kijipuktuk Mi'kmaq in 2022 to do my Master's of Social Work at Dalhousie. I said clinical program. It's not technically a clinical program, but it is a critical program, and clinical is my focus. I grew up non-consensually through childhood and adolescence in a fundamentalist Baptist Christian church and private school. So I have a lot of trauma from this as a queer person and as a woman. This dogma I was fed every day was really rife with homophobia, transphobia, rape culture, misogyny, purity culture. And all of this has influenced my work today. Perhaps you see the correlation. Art was a way of survival for me during this time. So after school, I immediately went to get a Bachelor of Fine Arts, where I investigated the performative space, performance art. There's a quote that says, in performance, the blood is real, it's not ketchup, for a way to kind of explain that what goes on in the performative space is a real ritual. So it's a real happening, a real space for transformation and catharsis. With that in mind, and my interest in sexual and sensual reclamation, I became interested in BDSM and wanted to explore, okay, well, if there's a real ritual happening in this space and real transformation, are there any therapeutic potentials? So I went back to school and got a Bachelor of Psychology. And during this time, I volunteered as a pro-choice reproductive health counselor at a local clinic in Winnipeg, and really fell in love with that one-on-one sex education client work. Decided I want to become a sex therapist, and found that sexuality is really a social issue. And for me, at least on the undergrad level, psychology didn't really talk about that or address it. It was more individualistic and quite pathologized. So I went the MSW route, and I'm excited to be sharing that I'm doing my optional thesis investigating BDSM codes of conduct and best practices among professional practitioners across Canada and the United States. And hopefully this will set the foundation for further research into any therapeutic potentials that might be possible within BDSM. And there's already quite a bit of empirical scholarship showing that there very well might be and likely is. So I just want to give a prompt for everyone before we start getting into definitions. Perhaps if you have a pen and paper, you can write this down or just think to yourself, what comes to mind when you think of BDSM? So, you know, we do see a lot of representation of BDSM in media and advertisements. I'm curious if some of you maybe think that's mainstream BDSM, or if some of you maybe feel it's a misrepresentation. So I invite you to sort of take notes of a couple things that come to mind. There's no wrong answers. You could even write down stereotypes you're aware of or assumptions. And then alongside this, what are some activities that our clients and community members might engage in that are BDSM adjacent? So while you might not be connected with folks who, you know, identify as being in the BDSM community or engaging with BDSM in particular, there's a lot of activities, especially within different sexual preferences, that may be BDSM adjacent. And so how can we differentiate between healthy consensual BDSM and abuse and coercion, even if our clients aren't, you know, stating that they're engaging in BDSM? So just something to think about. Please hold your questions and comments until the discussion period at the end. I think you're more than welcome to engage in the chat, but I will be open to addressing those near the end if we have time. And then, of course, if you'd like to reach out, I'm happy to share my email and offer further discussion for anyone. Okay, so BDSM stands for a couple different things. It can be referred to as BDSM, sadomasochism, or S&M. So I might use these terms interchangeably. This academic definition here from 2019 says that BDSM, previously known as sadomasochism or S&M, is an overarching abbreviation of bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadism and masochism, and refers to a physical, psychological, and sexual role play involving power exchange between consensual participants. A couple decades prior to this, in 1984, three researchers for S&M did a study where they basically gathered community definitions from people in the BDSM community about the 5 key elements that they think defines BDSM. So this includes the appearance of dominance and submission, or rule of one partner over the others, role playing or fantasy, consensuality and voluntary agreement, mutual definition, i.e. a shared understanding or informed consent of what's going to go on, and a sexual context. Although it is really important to note here that not everyone agreed that there needs to be a sexual context. There many times isn't a sexual context, but I would suggest that there's usually a sensual context because it's usually involving something physical and psychological. So Kathy Sisson is an anthropologist who talks about how cultures come to be formed and how we come to recognize something as a culture, in particular sexual cultures. So she says a sexual culture may be defined as a collective system of meanings and practices that emerges from historically specific and psychological conditions. So there are 6 main things that need to be in place for a sexual culture to sort of function and be recognized. Boundaries between that culture and the larger paradigmatic culture or society at large, or hegemonic culture, if you will. A story of origin and historical context, which we're going to get right into. Codes of behavior and conduct. A system of shared meanings about specific desires and behaviors. Along with this comes an understanding of what's an appropriate behavior or not and how to respond when someone does not follow codes of conduct. Means of social reproduction that allows newcomers to access and participate, so ways to orient people and help them learn how to do it safely. And then generating a sexual identity. So for some people, they do identify with BDSM as an orientation or an identity. So perhaps being a sadomasochist, a masochist, a top, a bottom, a dom, a sub, those kind of things can be actual identities for folks. Okay, so we're going to jump into our pretty dense timeline here. But I really think that this is so important to understand how the community has developed and how different the community and their practices are from the pathologization and early psychoanalysis and early kind of understanding of BDSM. So this timeline starts at 1785, but it's worth noting that sadomasochistic practice probably existed like throughout history under different names. In terms of the terminology of sadism and masochism, we started in 1785 with the book 120 Days of Sodom written by the Marquis de Sade in prison. It's believed that he was it's known that he was in prison for doing some of the acts written about in this book. I personally couldn't get through it. Some of you may know what it's about. It's essentially a recording of sexual assaults, torture, and murder that the Marquis de Sade and friends of his did to some young people in the community. So very, very violent, absolutely not representative of the type of sadism practiced within the BDSM community today, but that is where the word sadism comes from. Venus and Furs was published by Leopold von Sacher-Masoch in 1870. This is, again, a work of fiction that's believed to be based somewhat on a real relationship that the author had, and Sacher-Masoch is the namesake for masochism. So it was Krafft Ebing, an early psychoanalyst in 1886, who wrote about these two like the Marquis de Sade and Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, and created the name sadism and masochism based on these texts. And Kathy Sisson actually says, prior to this publication, S&M type behavior was considered neither sick nor sinful, and it was regarded often as a medical curiosity, if at all. Of course, Freud joined the party, couldn't resist, and so did Havelock Ellis. So these 3 men are the main sort of psychoanalysts who are known for the preliminary analysis, if you will, of S&M. I don't have time to get into the details of how their works vary and how their opinions vary, but I will talk about some of the overarching themes. So there's a general theme of biological determinism and intense gender binary. So there's the belief that men are inherently sadistic. It's an instinctual, natural part of them, and women are naturally masochistic or submissive, and that's a natural, instinctive part of women. And there's also the belief of the mind-body dualism. So this is really influenced by Christianity, but not necessarily just influenced by that. Basically, the idea that the civilized person supports the mind and rejects the urges and temptations of the body and does not acknowledge the inherent wisdom our bodies have. And so therefore, they set the tone for the pathologization of BDSM in suggesting that S&M behavior is something to repress, and that if you're not repressing it, something's wrong. It's hard to summarize these huge texts, but I think that gives a general idea of how the pathologization started. Sadism was listed in the first version of the DSM in 1952, alongside homosexuality and a couple other things. But masochism wasn't listed at this time. Okay, continuing on to the 1900s. So I have my little notes in front of me. So S&M networks, or like group activities, were beginning to grow. From the literature I've read, it's said that during this time, because sex workers were becoming more and more criminalized, S&M started to move into the space of private homes and private parties. And people got to know about one another from underground ads and different symbolism. There was some representation of S&M happening in the media at this time, in things called cheesecake magazines. Were fetish photos being published, S&M erotica producers around this time. But we see in 1957, as from the literature, is when the legal persecution of S&M producers started to really intensify under obscenity laws. Years later, in 1973, the SLAPS obscenity test was created. So what this stands for is serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, so the SLAPS test. So after 1973 and the SLAPS obscenity test came into play, as long as any works in representing or using S&M imagery could be defended as having serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, they were allowed to go forward and be published. And so this obviously opened the door for a lot more incorporation of BDSM imagery into popular media. You'll see above that I've noted that second wave feminism is known to have happened between the 60s and 90s. This is when the sex wars took place. So particularly, this refers to in-group arguments between feminists who were against S&M and feminists who were for S&M, but we will dive deeper into that. In 1968, I'll also just note that masochism was added to the second version of the DSM here. Okay, halfway through. I'm just looking for my notes here. All right, so 1970s, 1990s, end of the 20th century, we're seeing a lot of educational organizations or societies start to form. So the big ones happening in New York City and San Francisco, probably not surprisingly. These organizations offered support, guidelines, orientations for folks who wanted to become involved in the BDSM community and explore that side of themselves and meet other community members. We're starting to see an increase in media representations of S&M. How accurate they are is something that we have to question. And of course, in the late 1990s, we started to get the internet. So this really changed the way people were able to share information and communicate with one another and find community online. It's worth noting that homosexuality was removed from the DSM in 1973. Sadism and masochism are still listed in the version 3 and 4 of the DSM, but now they're listed as paraphilias, which is just a fancy way of saying an attraction to something that's unhealthy or unusual. During this time, there was also the height of the HIV and AIDS crisis. And so from the literature I've read that while the cis-het BDSM community and the queer BDSM community had started to collaborate during this time because of the stigma and discrimination against the queer community, there was a bit of they started to not collaborate as much, and the queer community, to a certain extent, the queer BDSM community moved a bit more underground again. But what I want to note about this slide is, so you're seeing things on here like the Folsom Street Fair being established, the National Leather Association forming, a leather archive museum opening in Chicago. So what I want to note about this is, at this point on the timeline, the BDSM community is pretty well established. There's like, you know, academic research, there's representation at conferences, there's these societies with guidelines. So at this point, it should be pretty clear that the sadism and masochism from the early definitions, especially sadism, is just simply no longer representative of the community. Like, and we should know that and be able to recognize those differences. The National Coalition of Sexual Freedom also formed in 1997, and they do a lot of work still today to record the discrimination faced by the community and advocate and fund research and things like that to reduce bias and discrimination. Last section of the timeline, folks. Thanks for holding on. Okay, so 2000s onwards to present day. We're seeing a lot of academic work now being done about BDSM, a lot of research. There was obviously research done earlier, but now we're seeing quite an influx of it. And a lot of this research is now tailored towards removing sadism and masochism from the DSM, in fact, removing paraphilias entirely. And then, of course, we see more media representations like 50 Shades of Grey. I mean, I think that was a pretty big cultural moment when 50 Shades of Grey was published. And then I think there were like 3 or 4 movies made about it. But this is where we can, again, question, how is BDSM being represented in media? Is it being represented properly? Umi Khan, who published Vicarious Kinks, S&M and the Socio-Legal Imaginary in 2014, that's one of the key texts that has informed my research. Khan writes a great chapter on media representations of S&M, and they make a really great point, a really powerful point, that a lot of the more socially acceptable representations of BDSM, like 50 Shades of Grey, feature white, cis-het, monogamous couples who typically are married already or plan to get married. And typically the man is the dominant and the woman's the submissive. Sometimes that's reversed, but in general, the whiteness, the cis-het side of things is typically what we see in the more socially acceptable media representations of BDSM. Hopefully this is beginning to change, but that's just something to really think about. Why is that more socially acceptable? How does monogamy play into that, and traditions of marriage and all that stuff? All right, so I want to talk a little bit about some legal cases here. So I wanted to do a whole section on law and BDSM, but for the sake of time, we'll just talk about a few examples. In general, there are multiple cases of custody battles where parents who were involved in BDSM lost custody of their children, not because of anything inappropriate, not because the children were exposed to it, but simply because it was brought up in court and they were assumed to be mentally unwell and unfit, and that it was an inappropriate practice. And so people have lost custody because of this. So we can really see in a lot of legal cases the impact of this bias and discrimination and misunderstanding of this community. The other big part of the legal considerations here is something we call the rough sex defense. So the rough sex defense refers to when people accused of sexual assault co-opt and appropriate the language of BDSM to try and get acquitted, or to suggest that what happened was actually just consensual rough sex. So an example of this is the big Gian Gomeshi case, who was found, of course, not guilty. He did try and argue that a lot of the abuse and assault that multiple people accused him of was just consensual rough sex, or BDSM. There was also a case in 2019 known as RV Hunter. This actually took place in Nova Scotia, where the accused was acquitted because he used the rough sex defense. And the judge actually said, almost verbatim, that more or less that it was understandable that he wouldn't have known that the woman he assaulted was no longer consenting because she had already consented to BDSM. And if BDSM codes of conduct are followed, this just is impossible. This can't happen. But it really shows the detrimental impacts of judges and people involved in law and policy not understanding what's involved in consensual and healthy BDSM. I did as well put, just last point here, Roe v. Wade being overturned in the United States. We're obviously seeing a huge moral panic happening, a lot of transphobia, homophobia, censorship of comprehensive sexual health care and education. This is an attack on the queer community, the trans community, the BDSM community. There's a lot of representation of different marginalized communities, including the queer and trans community within the BDSM community. And again, we know that with the censorship of comprehensive sexual health education and healthcare, this just opens the door for abuse and for people to be harmed and not know what consent is, not know how to take care of themselves and to protect themselves and how to, I could go on and on, you all know. Okay, we made it past the timeline, everybody. And it's only 12:38. I'll do my best. So let's talk about the sex wars. So I had sort of briefly mentioned what the sex wars are. It refers to in-group heated discourse, fighting, arguing within feminism, mainly primarily during the second wave, between feminists who were pro-S&M and feminists who are anti-S&M. You've probably all guessed that I'm pretty pro-S&M, but I want to make it clear that it's important for us to acknowledge these concerns and critically examine them and not just throw them out with the bathwater because we're pro-S&M. There's a lot of legitimate concern here that we need to consider. So I've taken from all the readings I've done, they're all in the references, and sort of compiled some of the main concerns and arguments of anti-S&M feminists during the sex wars. So does S&M practice reproduce, normalize, and perpetuate gendered violence? Do lesbian S&M practitioners reproduce patriarchy? I just put this one here because within the sex wars, a lot of that discourse was going on between radical lesbian feminists who are pro or anti-S&M. Is S&M an addiction? Is interest in S&M a conditioned response to patriarchy? Are we just sympathizing with our oppressors and reproducing the harm they've caused us? Sex purely for physical pleasure is inherently unfulfilling. And does S&M trivialize the powerlessness and oppression of racial and ethnic minorities or other marginalized groups? So these are really important questions to respond to and ask. So let's do that. So these responses are from me, but also an amalgamation of, again, like pro S&M responses from literature. So first of all, there's the belief that there is inherent wisdom and knowledge in the body, or we could call this a corporeal epistemology, if you like an academic term. So this idea that if we're feeling a sense of catharsis and healing and pleasure in our body, that there's a wisdom in that and that's worth investigating. Our bodies hold a lot of knowledge and wisdom, and so this view really rejects that mind over body dualism that we saw in the early psychoanalysis. S&M can also totally occur in long-term relationships and foster intimacy and tenderness, even if it doesn't occur in a long-term relationship. If any of you folks have experienced S&M in a positive way, that follows the codes of conduct, you'll likely agree that there's a lot of intimacy and tenderness involved, especially in that pre-negotiation, the check-ins, and that aftercare. Sex can be purely physical. As long as we're respecting one another and we're consenting, it's okay if we're just there to feel good. We don't need to have a long-term relationship or be in love for that to be legitimate. The big one here is asking ourselves, how should subversion be approached? So I'll explain what I mean by subversion, but what this question is saying is, how should we engage with S&M play that engages with systems of oppression? Can that be done safely? If so, how? And also that the addiction narrative we know pathologizes and generalizes. So if you're going to take anything away from this section, I want you to take away that we're not trying to delegitimize the concerns of folks who have issues or concerns around BDSM, but we just want to remember that abuse can happen in any type of relationship. It can happen within the BDSM world, just like it can in any other community or any other type of relationship. Same thing with addictive tendencies. These can happen with all different kinds of activities, and sex, like other activities, can involve exploitation and violence. What we as social workers have to do is educate ourselves so we can tell the difference and help our clients to be able to tell the difference. Okay, so let's talk about the big, confusing, tough part of this whole thing. How do you play with power? Is there space for tenderness, radical community care, healing, and transformative catharsis within sadomasochism? And if so, what are the roles of performance, ritual, subversion, and catharsis in BDSM? So I'm going to play a short clip from a video that features Judith Butler, a queer and gender theorist. The whole video is amazing. I definitely recommend you all watch the full thing, but I'm just going to show the clip on Butler talking about what it means to perform our identities and how performance really affects change. So Naj, did you want me to pause the recording while I play this?
No, you are good. And
Okay.
we will see if YouTube has to edit this for the YouTube channel. But for those of us that are watching this live, now is a good time. And if not, we're just going to edit this piece out for the YouTube replay. And
Perfect.
people can go and Google Judith Butler and learn all about her.
Please do. Okay, we'll get started here. Thank you.
I think at the time that I wrote Gender Trouble, people treated gender as if it was a natural fact or a sociological reality, but they didn't treat it as something that you could make and remake. Performance is important to the extent that we do enact who we are. And anybody in performance studies actually knows that there are performances that we do in our lives that are not mere performance, they're not fake. When performative was first coined as a word, the philosopher J.L. Austin was trying to understand legal utterances. So when a judge says, I declare you man and wife, you become man and wife once that declaration has happened. That's not fake. That happened. Now, what if we were to say that in enacting our lives as a particular gender, we are actually realizing that gender anew. We are making something real happen. When gay and lesbian people started coming out, or when trans people started living openly, something changed in the world. By appearing, speaking, acting in certain ways, reality changed. And it has changed. We are seeing the changing of terms. We no longer speak about family, woman, man, desire, sex in the same way. Even the Cambridge Dictionary acknowledges that something has changed. Okay, so when we talk about performative, we're talking about an act that makes something come into being or an act that has real consequences. We're talking about the changing of reality.
Oh, I love that video. So good. The whole thing is like that, but more and more. So Judith Butler's talking about how we perform.
And I'm going to just interrupt for a second and invite you to go to the next screen, because it's possible that we will stop the editing at this point.
Got it. All right.
Perfect.
Oops. You can read ahead if you want to, everyone, but I'll try and introduce this here. So Judith Butler's talking about how we perform little rituals every day, and that creates real change. It makes us who we are. It makes our relationships. It makes our societies, our cultures, and we create that by the way we perform together. And so in the same way, we have the power to also create change, as she says near the end. So I believe that when engaging in BDSM, whether scene, play, whatever you want to call it, there's a real performative ritual happening. What's going on is real. There's people interacting and doing something together that has real effects for the mind, the body, the relationship between whoever's interacting. I'm not going to read this whole quote about rituals, but just the first part, really, that rituals are performative. So anything from shaking hands, like I said, to how we deal with death and grief, religion, how we learn, how we overthrow the status quo, which I've highlighted there. So yes, BDSM is a performative ritual, but what's the key element here when we're talking about power dynamics? That's subversion. So we need to talk about the role of subversion in this performative ritual. It's the key element, I believe, in how the community is able to interact with potentially traumatic situations, systems of oppression, power dynamics in a way that subverts it and changes it. So I'm going to read this quote and explain it as I go. So subversive affirmation is an artistic or political tactic that allows artists and activists, or people engaging in BDSM as well, to take part in certain social, political, or economic discourses and to affirm, appropriate, or consume them. So to replicate them through role play or whatever, what have you, while simultaneously undermining them. So subversive affirmation is characterized precisely by the fact that with the affirmation or the replication or role plays of a system of oppression or power, there is simultaneously taking place a distancing from or a revelation of what is being affirmed or replicated. So there is always a surplus or an additional element which destabilizes this replication and turns it into its opposite. So this is the key element of the performance and ritual, if you will, of BDSM that replicates these difficult topics, but does it in a way that doesn't perpetuate them. It's a consensual interaction and approach to them that subverts it and turns it into its opposite and allows for discourse, allows for hopefully catharsis or a purging. And this is where a lot of the healing for folks is found. So to give an example, I wanted to share a personal story. I did mention that or maybe I forgot to mention that I incorporate BDSM into my own personal life, but I've also worked and hired professional BDSM practitioners as part of my own journey to reclaim my bodily autonomy, sexual autonomy, and healing. And for me, a lot of my trauma from my experience in the church had to do with figures in authority, enforcing this dogma of rape culture, misogyny, homophobia, purity culture, and all these things. And we would be shamed and we would be punished publicly often. And so for me, I felt the desire to explore that with a femdom who could help me sort of replicate that experience, but in a subverted way. And the key element here is, and we did that and it went well. Perhaps she made me kneel and kiss her boots while she called me an unholy slut, excuse my language. But that sort of replication through subversion was extremely healing for me, because the key difference here is that we pre-negotiated why I was there, what sort of healing I was looking for, what my hard no's were and what wasn't safe to explore. And then there were check-ins throughout and a lot of tenderness throughout. And then of course, aftercare and debrief. So I just wanted to give that example as a way to explain what I mean here. If none of this resonates with you or you have issues with it, that's okay. I welcome, discussion. But if you're going to take anything away, I just want you to take away that the goal of BDSM practice within the community, as established by the cultural formation and codes of conduct, it's been conceptualized by practitioners as power with, so not power over, power with, or empowerment, described as a process in which power is something to share, something to use for the enhancement of others. So I hope that that's the takeaway from that. Let's just talk about some practical safety tips. So these are all established codes of conduct within the community. These are some clear ways that you can help your clients distinguish between abuse, coercion, and exploitation in healthy consensual BDSM. These also can be used for clients who are engaging in BDSM adjacent activities, so liking to get choked or spanked in sex, things like that. We still want to, use safety protocols to make sure that's done in a healthy consensual way. So these include, there's two really popular codes of conduct that pertain to BDSM consent practices. So the first is RAC, or risk-aware consensual kink. The second very common one is SSC, or safe, sane, and consensual. Some folks don't like the use of the word sane and feel it can be pretty ableist. I do agree with this. I think the general point with both is that everyone's informed and aware of what risks could happen, what's going to go on in a scene. Or session. A scene is what we refer to as a BDSM session. And so there's different ways that folks are able to understand. And so perhaps the word sane is no longer best used for this. There's always negotiation ahead of time. This is a very clear requirement of healthy consensual BDSM. Sometimes this negotiation can look like the form of contracts or just a discussion. I filled out a contract before. It was like a page-long document with all the different things that could come up in a scene. And there's a scale of, yes, I really want to try this. Let's try this slowly, or no, and what we call a hard no, something you will absolutely not go towards or try. And then, of course, the establishment of safe words, safe symbols if you're unable to speak, and check-ins before, during, and after. So during is a really key point that is not always mentioned in all the literature, but Milena Williams is a Black sadomasochist activist and writer, and she has talked about her experience engaging with race play, which is a pretty taboo element even within the BDSM community. But she talks about her experience with that and how important check-ins during are, because sometimes when you're really in the moment, you might forget your safe word or your safe symbol. So I really like her work on clarifying that. And then, of course, aftercare and debrief. So, it could be hydrating, having snacks, snuggling, just talking about the experience and how it went. So more like these are all important ways that we can distinguish between abuse and healthy BDSM. I know we're close to 1, so I was just going to breeze through this slide.
You're good.
I'm good. Okay. So there's a lot of overlap of representation of many different marginalized communities within the BDSM community, and a lot of amazing, really informative writing and advocacy work done. This is a non-exhaustive list, obviously, but I have resources, which I'm happy to send out to folks for further reading from members of these different communities on their experience within the BDSM community. I really love a lot of the writing from, the disabled community about pain beliefs and how we put value on what's considered good pain or bad pain. Ariane Cruz wrote The Color of Kink, which is a really amazing book that talks a lot about race play and how taboo it is, and she really breaks down what subversion means in that space. Obviously, there's a ton of overlap with the queer community in BDSM. Gail Rubin, queer theorist, has a lot of awesome writings on that and her experience as a lesbian sadomasochist and how that was for her during the sex wars. In terms of BDSM and Indigenous communities, I want to be transparent that I have more research to do in this area. But what I wanted to say about this point is some of you may be familiar with the work of Kent Monkman, who's an artist, an Indigenous artist, or Dana Danger, who's an Indigenous artist. And both of them have incorporated BDSM in their work as a form of, bodily reclamation, sexual sovereignty that I spoke about earlier. And it's some really interesting work, and there's some great writings about that as well. So I've also attached those in the resources. This could be its own presentation, but just to say that we need to ask ourselves, what community care, safety, acceptance are these folks finding within the BDSM space? And if we have concerns about the replication and perpetuation of, harmful power dynamics or systems of oppression, let's talk to the folks who are implicated by those who choose to be in the community and hear what they have to say about their experience. That's really important before making assumptions. So we're nearing the end. So what can we take away from today? If you remember anything at all, it's what do we need to do as social workers to show up for our clients in our community? So whether or not, you support BDSM, we have to meet our clients with unconditional positive regard and no judgment, and we have to help them be safe. So how do we distinguish between abuse and healthy consensual BDSM? We talked a lot about that in some different really clear ways to tell the difference and help our clients to tell the difference. How to engage in those discussions around safety and consent with clients. And then, of course, clients who engage in BDSM adjacent activities. We have to understand how and why BDSM is so pathologized and how this has harmed and misrepresented the community. And we talked a little bit about the implications in law, especially people appropriating the use of BDSM to try and get away with things like sexual assault. We need to be aware of resources to support clients who want to engage in BDSM or BDSM related activities and where to learn more ourselves. Again, I'm happy to provide that for you folks. And I'll repeat it again. We got to meet our clients with unconditional positive regard and no judgment. And the statistics show that a lot of people engage in BDSM or BDSM adjacent activities. So it's happening. It's happening. We can't deny it. And we have to understand and be educated and show up for our community. So that really brings me to the end here. Thank you all so much for listening. And I was so nervous. That went better than I expected, but I'll pass it to you, Naj.
Thank you so very much. Grateful to have you with us, to have this opportunity to learn and unlearn. You said very importantly the ways in which it's happening. And the question is, are we as social workers providing safe space for people to talk about what they're thinking about or reflecting or doing? And how does our knowledge help or harm us? So please put everyone in the chat your questions. I also had a question that was sent around, can we have access to your PowerPoint? So if you are going to send it to me, what I'm going to do is I'm putting in the chat my own email so that people can contact me for a copy of the PowerPoint so that you can see that there. And please put in the chat your questions. For some reason, my chat is acting up, so I'm going to, here it is.
Oh, Britt and Meg.
Okay.
Some of my colleagues came today, so thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so there's definitely, I think, a lot of love that's been coming at you for being willing to share so bravely of your story and to help us understand a little bit about the ways in which appropriately negotiated with lots of effort around consent and awareness and resources, it can be a tool for healing for some people. And I'm definitely getting some comments around how to help us begin that. If anyone has any other questions or comments, one of the things that's very important in terms of safer social work practice is practitioners need to know and understand and educate themselves and be comfortable talking about things or listening to things in order to be able to show up and support the people they're working with without their own biases or discomfort or issues impacting people's ability to talk about the things they're thinking about. Definitely your reflections on performance and subversiveness and that role within sexuality is some of the comments that we're getting. If anyone has any other questions or comments, if not, yeah. So everyone is learning so much. Some of you are replying just to hosts and panelists instead of to everyone. So I'm just giving you that heads up. But we are very grateful to you for sharing of your wisdom. And again, part of ethical social work practice is number one, learning and unlearning. Number two, being aware of our own positionality, our own biases, our own issues, how that impacts how we can listen and how we respond. And then just becoming aware of more around sex therapy in general and the work that hopefully Madeline is going to continue to lead here in Unceded Mi'kmaq, so that we can be better positioned. A question just came up around dissociation for trauma survivors and how that is worked on specifically when it comes to perhaps issues of consent or how consent might change during an experience. And you referenced it briefly, but I'm wondering if you can share a little bit.
I just want to read that question here.
So yeah, the question is, and then there's another question that's around, how is this a manifestation of trauma? So you might want to maybe start with how is this a manifestation of trauma, and then what happens if there is dissociation for trauma survivors and how can that be worked with?
Yeah. So in terms of whether or not I think that this is a manifestation of trauma, I'm unsure if you're asking me if I think an attraction to BDSM or a desire to participate is a manifestation of trauma, or if it, well, yeah, I guess that must be the question.
The
I don't
question,
know.
it's
Oh,
not, apparently it's not, but I
Okay,
think it would be
I'll
good
let
to
you
answer
rewrite
that
it.
question. But I think it would be good to answer that question while the person is typing out more about what they meant by their question, because that is still a good question to ask.
So I think experiencing trauma and really having been directly impacted by, you know, different systems of oppression or different really harmful power dynamics can definitely be a reason why someone later might be interested in exploring and readdressing those experiences through BDSM. So I do think like having a background of trauma, yeah, can sort of maybe prime you for an interest in that later, because that's what a lot of BDSM does. And not all BDSM is addressing these, you know, big systemic issues or these power dynamics. Sometimes it's more about just intense sensation and pleasure. But if it is something that someone's doing, like the example I gave, where it was an attempt to heal and find catharsis, then yeah, I think it makes sense that if you have a background in trauma, that might be something that you want to sort of explore in your BDSM practice. I'm curious to hear what Holly meant by that question. In terms of Glenda's, a question that comes to mind relates with dissociation for trauma survivors and how this is worked with. I just want to be really clear that I want to be careful answering this question. I don't quite feel ready to talk about how dissociation might come up in a BDSM session for trauma survivors who might dissociate. Like, this is why it is a tricky thing, right? Like, if you're replicating, even in a subverted way, things that were traumatic for you, dissociation is possible. I mentioned Molena Williams, who shares her experience with race play. That was something that she, as a Black woman, really wanted to explore with her BDSM community members. And there's a podcast actually, which I'm happy to link you to, where she talks about how that experience went really poorly for her because she actually dissociated during the scene, and they hadn't negotiated properly how to do check-ins just in case that dissociation happened. So I think in terms of engaging with trauma survivors and addressing the trauma in BDSM, that's why safety and pre-negotiation is so important. Like, it's just like any sort of safety planning. I hope that answers the question. I think I'm hesitant to answer it more just because the research on the therapeutic potentials of BDSM are quite limited. And while sometimes trauma is explored through things like role play and therapy, there's obviously that more physical, immersive element to BDSM. Yeah, yeah. So I hope that answers the question.
It does, is what I'm seeing. And so when we're talking about reenactment and the ways in which this can help someone kind of go from a place of powerlessness to reenacting, to beginning to experience, and then there may be more that will come out of that will then be brought back into a therapeutic context. But you've highlighted repeatedly the role of consent, negotiations, repeated check-ins at differing points in order to, and if someone is aware of their own dissociative impulses or tells, then that can be something. If you notice me not responding, for example, that means that I might be dissociating. That's another way that the person is having an opportunity to check in at differing points. And it's part of looking at that from a safer perspective and using that as a catalyst towards healing for some. For others, it could be just about pleasure, as is being mentioned in the chat. But it's very new, right? So it's about creating opportunities for more learning, more research, which you are doing, and hopefully there will be more opportunities. There's a comment here. Jillian Keenan addresses this question in some of her YouTube videos. She explains that for her, her orientation, as she refers to her sexual interest, is not rooted in an experience of trauma. And that's the piece. It's complicated and different for many different people.
Yeah, so I think I focused a little bit heavily on the engaging with traumatic memories and systems of oppression, because that's where a lot of the concerns really lie with BDSM. But oh yeah, sometimes it's just for fun or because it feels good. Some people enjoy intense sensation. There's also I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I know there must be some research about how when you're maybe aroused or feeling pleasure, intense sensation in different ways that may not feel good when we're just walking around in the world can feel really nice and really like engaging. Yeah, and so I know I mentioned like the healing part of having a femdom call me an unholy slut, but also like part of that's just me feeling empowered and loving that. It's not necessarily that it's like a therapeutic thing for me anymore, whereas it might have been at the beginning. But yeah, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a manifestation of trauma. I understand the question now.
Yes, and now there's another comment. I'm guessing that although the two participants engage in BDSM, one or both may not always have the ability or knowledge to know what or how to deal with dissociation and trauma. This is where the therapist comes into play to assist with processing, right? So even though BDSM is much broader, the purpose of this Lunch and Learn is to just begin to expose our members to understanding the larger complexity, to inspire them to continue to learn and grow and be aware so that they can be better positioned to understand some of the dynamics that they might be exposed to from the people they're working with. Obviously, as social workers, healing is important, but it's also important to know when is safe, when is not safe, in order to begin to have some of those conversations where if we don't feel comfortable talking about sexuality at all, then there may be a lot of stuff that we're missing. And so that's the beginning of just starting this conversation, starting this research, starting this learning and unlearning, so that we can be able to be aware of how our stuff might impact others.
I'm really so thankful. I mean, especially within the field of social work, like being able to have this discussion is so amazing. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and personal experience with our members. Thank you to our members for wonderful dialogue through our chat. And thank you to everyone who's joining us as we begin to see this. And again, you can contact me. Madeline will hopefully send me a copy of her presentation. So there's all sorts of wonderful resources for deeper learning and deeper reflections on the ways in which sometimes our biases might impact our ability to be able to provide safe social work spaces for the people we work with. Thank you all. And Madeline, I hope you're taking in some of the gratitude that's
I am. Thank you so much.
I mean, flowing through with the hearts and
I did. It really helps, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to be at a panel at 5:45 on Friday at the Atlantic Sex Show. If any of you are going, maybe we can connect there.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And to everyone, stay safe out there, especially on this snowy day in beautiful unceded Mi'kma'ki. And Madeline, thank you so much for sharing some of your research and some of your knowledge and experiences with us. We appreciate you. And have a safer social work day because of your learning today. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks.